Sira sat among the crowded lanes of the great bazaar of Vera, yet her presence created a strange silence wherever she went, for her size alone made others wary. She was Thryn, a warrior race known for their towering forms and brutal strength, but even among her people she was unmatched, taller than most by an entire head, with shoulders broad as fortress walls and a reputation carved from battles long past. The other merchants whispered her name whenever she passed, though few dared meet her gaze and fewer still attempted conversation. To them, she was a figure of both awe and fear, a legend that had taken shape into living flesh. And though her reputation had been earned with countless victories, she was left with an isolation she had never chosen. So she sat alone at a stone table in the bazaar, her eyes tracing the movement of small traders and alien pilgrims who hurried past, pretending not to stare yet, unable to resist glancing at the warrior giantess whose shadow stretched across the plaza like a looming wall. Her heart was not as heavy as her frame, but it carried the weight of a truth she never spoke aloud. Strength had given her everything and taken just as much. The bazaar itself was alive with sound, a chaos of languages and scents that drifted through the air like a living storm. The calls of vendors selling starfruit, the clang of metal trinkets forged by local smiths, and the hiss of boiling oils from cooking stalls blended into a constant hum. Shuttles landed at the docking ring overhead, sending streams of traders through the gates. To the average eye, Vera was a paradise of commerce, a hub that connected distant worlds. But for Sira, it was a place where she existed on the edge of belonging. She had fought wars for the Thryn Empire, crushed enemies who once threatened her kind, and carried the honor of her people in more battles than most could count. Yet here, in a city filled with life, she was nothing more than a reminder of a weapon too dangerous to wield casually. Those who respected her power also feared the closeness it demanded, and those who admired her form never dared approach beyond a distance safe enough for whispers. She understood this unspoken wall, yet she did not resent them for it. She had chosen the warrior's path long ago, and now she lived with its shadow. Still, there were moments when her chest ached at the simple sight of companions laughing at a stall or bargaining over a meal, because she knew such small connections were treasures she might never touch. It was in one of those moments, as she rested her hand over the stone table and let her thoughts drift like smoke, that she noticed something unusual among the crowd. Moving between stalls with the calm ease of someone unfamiliar with fear was a man unlike the others she had seen on Vera. He was human, shorter than the average merchant, his steps unhurried as he examined goods without flinching under the wary stares that most newcomers endured. His hair was dark and cut short, his build strong though not exaggerated, and his clothes marked him as a traveler rather than a resident. But what caught Sira's attention was not his size or his form, but the way his eyes wandered without hesitation, as though he sought no permission to exist among those who judged him. When his gaze finally found hers, she expected the usual reaction: a quick retreat, a turn away, or the nervous look of one caught in danger. Instead, his lips curved into a simple smile, small and unassuming, yet directed openly toward her. For a moment she thought she had misread it, but there it was again, steady, genuine, unshaken. The bazaar seemed to hush around her in that instant, though she knew it was only her own mind sharpening its focus. No one had dared offer her such an expression before. She had been greeted with respect, with fear, with admiration, even with suspicion, but never with something so ordinary and human as a smile that carried no weight beyond itself. Her first instinct was to think it mockery, that perhaps this human wished to provoke her, to laugh at the giantess who sat alone as if she were an exhibit. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the table, and the stone beneath her hand creaked faintly. But when she looked again, she found no trace of ridicule in his expression. The man held her gaze as naturally as if he were greeting a neighbor across a quiet street, then turned to continue browsing a nearby stall, leaving her with a feeling that unsettled her more than any battlefield could. Sira shifted slightly in her seat, her thoughts moving faster than the steady rhythm of the bazaar around her. Who was he, and why had he dared to look at her without fear? The Thryn males of her kind never did so unless they sought to challenge her. and the aliens of other species only watched her from afar, speaking her name as though it were a tale rather than a person. Yet this human, who could not match her, size or strength in any measure, had crossed the unspoken boundary with a single act of calm boldness. For the first time in years, she felt her heartbeat quicken, not from the thrill of combat, but from a spark of something she could not yet name. It was unfamiliar, unsettling but not unwelcome. She had faced enemies with blades drawn and survived storms of fire across planets, yet the thought of a single smile lingered in her mind longer than the roar of 1,000 battles. The sun of Vera dipped lower in the horizon, casting long shadows across the bazaar. Traders began to pack their goods, voices lowering as the evening hour approached, yet Sira remained seated, still glancing toward the stalls where the human wandered. He did not hurry, nor did he avoid her presence. At one point, he bought a small bundle of food wrapped in cloth, and as he passed by her table once more, his eyes flicked toward hers with that same ease. And again, there was that smile. It was nothing more than a curve of lips, simple and fleeting, but to her it felt as though the silence around her had been broken. She did not move, did not speak, but deep within, something stirred, an awareness that her world, long defined by distance and solitude, might soon change in ways she could not predict. And so, as the last light of the day stretched across the marketplace and the voices of the crowd blended into the steady hum of nightfall, Sira sat with a mind far less silent than before. She did not yet know his name, his purpose, or why fate had guided a human traveler into her path. But she knew one thing with certainty. The smile of a stranger had done what no rival warrior or battle cry had ever managed. It had reached the heart of the giantess of Vera. Aisi बेटी जो पहली स्टोरी में हो चुकी है वो repeat ना हो. The human traveler moved through the night market with quiet steps, his presence marked by calm focus, rather than the nervous haste of most strangers. Lanterns strung across the bazaar swayed in the breeze, their glow spilling soft light across the stone floors, and the murmur of evening trade filled the air. He paused at stalls, trading a few coins for dried fruit, and inspected tools crafted by alien artisans with an interest that seemed more genuine than a merchant's. All the while, Sira watched him from where she sat, her massive frame partially hidden in shadow, though she doubted such a thing could ever make her unseen. She had no reason to stare, yet she did, her eyes following him with a pull she could neither dismiss nor explain. The warrior within her urged restraint, warning her that curiosity toward an unknown traveler was a weakness, yet the part of her that had endured too many years of solitude whispered differently. She had lived her life in silence, shielded by the wall of her size, and now here was someone who had stepped past that wall without hesitation. When at last he stopped at a stall near her table, closer than any outsider had willingly come in months, she realized that if she said nothing, now she might regret it for longer than she cared to admit. Human. Her voice rumbled deep and low, and the sound alone was enough to make nearby merchants glance her way. The traveler turned, his expression unshaken, as if the voice of a giantess were no more startling than a passing greeting. He inclined his head slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement rather than fear. "You call me so," he said, his tone calm, his words simple, "but I do not know what you are called." For a moment, Sira was caught off guard, though she did not let it show on her face. Few ever asked her name directly, for they already knew it through rumor or feared the weight of speaking it aloud. To hear the question spoken so plainly was disarming. "Sira?" she said at last, and her name seemed to linger in the air, carried by the hum of lantern light. The man nodded once. "Then I greet you, Sira. My name is Ilyas." The sound of his name settled into her thoughts, unexpected in its simplicity. Elias. She turned it over in her mind as she regarded him, measuring his stance, his tone, his intent. He did not avert his eyes as most would have, though he also did not challenge her with the false boldness she had seen in many warriors. Instead, there was steadiness in him, a quiet confidence that came not from strength of body but from a calm spirit. "You are not from Vera," she said, more statement than question. Elias gave a small shake of his head. No. I travel between worlds, carrying what I need and leaving what I can behind. Vera is only another stop along the way. His answer was direct, unburdened by the need to impress. It was a kind of honesty that Sira had rarely encountered, for most who spoke to her sought either favor or fear. A silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable but weighted with curiosity. Elias broke it first. Why does one such as you sit alone? The question might have sounded foolish or even insulting from another, but his tone carried no mockery. He asked as one who truly wished to know. Sira's gaze lowered slightly, not in shame but in consideration. She had been asked about her victories, about her battles, about the scars she bore and the enemies she had crushed, but never about her solitude. She considered giving no answer, yet something within compelled her otherwise. Because strength is a wall, she said finally, her voice quieter than before. It protects, but it also keeps others away. Few dare to cross it. Elias studied her for a moment, then gave the smallest of smiles, the same one he had offered her earlier. Walls can be crossed, he said simply, if one chooses not to fear them. Her chest stirred at the words, an unfamiliar sensation that unsettled her more than any blade ever had. He spoke them without weight, as though it were the most natural thing in the universe, yet they carried a truth she had long denied. Sira had always believed her solitude was unchangeable, a consequence of the path she had chosen as a warrior, yet here stood a man who had stepped into her silence as easily as one might cross a street. She searched his face for deception but found none, only that steady calm, that unyielding ease that made him seem immune to the gravity of her presence. The bazaar around them shifted as the night deepened, vendors closing their stalls in shadows, stretching long across the ground. The air cooled, carrying the scent of spices and smoke. Still, Elias lingered near her table, and though he did not press her with more questions, his presence was strangely grounding. At length he asked, "Do you fight still? Or has peace found you here?" Sira's lips curved faintly, not quite, a smile but close enough. "Peace does not come easily to those like me," she answered. "The battles end, but the silence remains." Elias nodded, as if he understood, though she doubted he could fully know the weight of such a life. Yet there was no pity in his gaze, only acknowledgement, and that alone was enough to soften something within her. She found herself speaking more than she intended, telling him fragments of her past, how she had once led Thrin soldiers into war, how she had stood as the shield of her people, how her victories had shaped her reputation into a legend too heavy to set aside. Elias listened without interruption, his attention steady, as though every word mattered. For Sira, it was both strange and freeing. She had spoken of such things before, but always as answers to challenge or pride, never as fragments of a life shared with another. When she paused, Elias only said, "And yet you still sit here, not as legend, but as yourself." The words struck her deeply more than she wished to admit. The night grew late, stars gleaming overhead through the transparent dome that shielded the bazaar. Few remained, save for wandering travelers and the hum of distant engines. Elias finally stood, adjusting the strap of his small pack across his shoulder. "I will see more of this world tomorrow," he said, his tone matter-of-fact, as though it were a promise rather than farewell. Then, with one last nod, he turned to leave. Sira watched him go, her massive frame unmoving, yet inside her chest, there was a shift like the crack of stone under pressure. For years she had accepted her solitude as unbreakable, yet with the arrival of a single human traveler, she found herself wondering if the wall she lived behind was not as unshakable as she once believed. That night, as she returned to her dwelling, carved into the cliffs above the city, her thoughts did not rest as they usually did. Instead, the memory of Elias lingered, his calm voice, his steady eyes, his unshaken smile. She did not know why fate had placed him on Vera, or why he had dared approach her when so many others would not. But she knew with certainty that his presence had changed the rhythm of her silence. And as she stood beneath the starlight, looking out across the endless sprawl of the trade world, Sira realized that for the first time in years, she was not only watching life pass by, she was waiting for what she could not yet name. The morning light spread across the cliffs of Vera, glinting against the glassy domes of the city below, and the sprawling trade bazaar began to stir with life once again. Sira awoke before the merchants had even lifted their stalls, her mind unsettled by thoughts of the human who had spoken to her the night before. She was no stranger to strangers. Across her long years she had seen envoys, soldiers, and wanderers come and go. But Elias had been different. His words had not sought to test her, nor had his eyes carried the weight of judgment. Instead, he had looked at her as though she were not a giant to be feared, but simply someone worth knowing. That truth was harder for her to push aside than she expected. Sira descended into the city with the silent tread of someone used to drawing attention. As always, eyes followed her immense frame, but today she noticed them less. She found herself searching instead, scanning the stalls and the streams of arriving ships for a figure she had seen only once yet could already recognize. And when she saw him, calm, carrying his pack, speaking to a merchant as though he had lived here for years, she felt something shift again within her chest. Elias greeted her with the same steady manner as before, as if seeing a warrior twice. His size was nothing unusual. He offered her a nod and a smile, and the sight of it made something in her heart stir uncomfortably. "Sira," he said plainly, "I was hoping you would return." Few ever hoped for her presence. Most endured. The words landed like a weight she did not know how to carry. Before she could answer, a disturbance rippled through the bazaar. A trio of armored figures draped in the black and crimson colors of the Kelm Dominion strode into the square. Their reputation was well known even on Vera. They were enforcers, not merchants, and wherever they walked, silence followed. Sira felt the tension tighten around her as merchants backed away, leaving only Elias standing near her side, his eyes fixed on the newcomers. The Dominion soldiers stopped in the center of the square, scanning the crowd. Their leader, a scarred Thryn male nearly as large as Sira, raised his voice. "By order of the Dominion, all trade must halt until inspection is complete." It was an excuse. Sira knew it. Everyone knew it. Inspections were nothing more than a reason to seize goods, intimidate travelers, and remind the bazaar who truly held power. Normally, she would remain apart from such things. Her size and strength made her a poor target for harassment. But stepping in meant drawing attention she preferred to avoid. Yet, as she stood in the shadows, her eyes flicked to Elias. He did not cower. He did not leave. He stood as calmly as he had stood before her, as though waiting to see how the world would shape itself around him. Then one of the soldiers noticed him. "Human," the enforcer sneered, stepping forward. "Show your papers." Elias opened his pack, moving with steady hands, but the soldier shoved him roughly before he could speak, his belongings scattered to the stone ground. The bazaar grew silent, all eyes fixed on the lone traveler facing the Dominion's cruelty. Before Sira even thought about it, she moved. Her massive shadow fell across Elias and the soldier, and her voice carried like thunder through the air. "Enough." The crowd stilled. The enforcer froze, his head tilting upward to meet her gaze. For a moment, silence reigned, broken only by the flicker of lanterns and the hum of distant engines. The soldier stepped back half a pace, clearly aware of who stood before him. "This does not concern you, Sira of the Thryn," he said, though his tone carried less certainty than he wished. Her golden eyes narrowed. "It does now." Elias bent to gather his scattered belongings, his calm composure never faltering, yet Sira could see the faintest spark of something behind his stillness. Acceptance, perhaps, that she had chosen to stand beside him. The leader of the Dominion soldiers strode forward, his heavy armor clanking with each step. He towered taller than most, though still fell short of Sira's immense form. "You would interfere in Dominion matters?" His voice was sharp, designed to provoke. Sira stepped closer, her sheer size forcing him to tilt his head back. You mistake bullying for law, she said, and I have little patience for either. The tension was unbearable, a coil of silence that threatened to snap. Then Elias spoke, his tone calm yet carrying through the square. If you wish to inspect, inspect me. But theft and threats do not make law, they make weakness. The words were simple, yet they carried a weight that struck even harder than Syrah's thunderous tone. The Dominion leader's gaze flicked to Elias, clearly unamused. But in that moment, Syrah understood something. The human did not challenge with force, but with unshakable resolve. Where most bent or broke, he stood steady. And somehow, that steadiness was more dangerous to the Dominion than any blade. Soldiers hesitated, their false authority shaken by the presence of a giantess who would not move and a human who would not yield. Finally, with a sharp motion, the leader signaled retreat. "This is not finished," he hissed. Before turning away, the trio withdrew, and the crowd released a collective breath. Merchants whispered, glancing between Syrah and Elias, as if uncertain what bond had just been forged between them. Syrah turned to him, her expression unreadable. "You should have left," she said, her tone more firm than she intended. Elias straightened his pack, dusting it off with quiet composure. "And let them believe they could take what they wished?" He shook his head. "Walls can only be crossed if someone dares to walk forward. Sometimes that means standing still." His words echoed the ones he had spoken the night before, and they struck her deeper this time. She had built her life on strength, on the power of force and reputation. Yet Elias reminded her that sometimes strength was found in refusal, in stillness, in the courage to not bow. As the bazaar slowly returned to life, Syrah realized something had shifted. She was no longer the silent giantess watching from the shadows, nor was Elias just a traveler passing through. Together they had drawn the gaze of the Dominion, and such eyes never looked away for long. Yet even as danger pressed closer, Syrah felt no regret. For the first time in years, she was no longer standing alone. And though she did not yet understand what path lay before them, she knew that it would not be shaped by silence. It would be forged by the choice to step beyond. Walls that night, as she stood once again on the cliffs above Vera, the stars brighter than ever against the black sky, she realized her solitude had been broken. Not shattered by force, but crossed by a single human who had dared to walk forward without fear. And in that realization, the future felt less like an empty horizon and more like the beginning of something she had not dared to hope for. The night air on Vera was thick with the smell of spice smoke drifting from the bazaar, but the laughter and song that usually followed the end of trade were strangely absent. Syrah stood at the edge of the market, her colossal form dimly lit by lanterns swinging in the breeze. She could feel the weight of eyes on her, whispers carrying through the crowd. The story of what had happened earlier with the Dominion soldiers had already spread, how she, the solitary giantess, had stepped into the square and silenced armored enforcers with a single word. And more than that, how a human traveler had stood beside her without flinching. In Vera's streets, reputation was as real as currency, and tonight both hers and Elias's had changed. She tried to ignore it, but a part of her couldn't shake, the thought that by interfering, she had set something in motion she could no longer control. Elias walked beside her, quiet, his steps deliberate. He didn't fill silence with needless words, which was strange for one so small. Most beings around Syrah either tried to prove themselves with chatter or shrank into silence from fear. Elias seemed to carry a different stillness, something chosen, not forced. She glanced at him, noticing how the firelight caught in his dark hair, how he seemed untroubled by the stares of the crowd. He looked like a man accustomed to being underestimated, yet he moved as though every step was placed exactly where it was meant to be. "You realize what happened today will not vanish," she finally said, her voice low, meant only for him. Elias nodded, unsurprised. "The Dominion doesn't forgive embarrassment. They'll return, and next time they'll come prepared." He said it calmly, without fear, as if he were stating the weather. The notion unsettled her more than the threat itself. Most who crossed the Dominion lived with the dread of waiting for the hammer to fall. Elias carried no such dread. "Why are you not afraid?" she asked, though the question slipped out before she could stop herself. He looked at her, and for the first time since they met, she saw something sharp in his eyes, something beneath the calm. "Fear is useful," he said, "but it's not a guide. If I let it decide every step, I'd never walk forward." His words were simple, but they left a mark. She remembered her younger years, training among her kin, her great strength, both a gift and a curse. Even then she had learned that strength alone could not keep loneliness away. Walls of muscle and armor were still walls, and she had built hers higher than most. Their path led them to the outer edges of the bazaar, where the glow of lanterns faded into the pale blue light of Vera's moons. Sira often came here at night to watch the horizon, but tonight, another figure was already waiting. A fellow, thin, massive and broad, with dark ridges along his arms that caught the moonlight. She recognized him instantly, Varric, a warrior once of her own clan. He had left long ago to serve as a blade for hire, and his presence here could only mean one thing. "So the rumors are true," Varric rumbled, his eyes narrowing. "Sira, the silent giantess, has finally chosen a side, and with her, a human." The way he spoke the word carried both mockery and disbelief. Elias's posture didn't shift, though his eyes sharpened slightly. Varric stepped closer, his massive frame nearly equal to hers. "The Dominion is not pleased, Sira. They see your defiance as betrayal, and betrayal has a price." His words were meant to intimidate, yet she heard something more in them. A test. Varric had once respected her strength. Perhaps he still did. "You came to deliver their warning?" Sira asked, her voice steady. "Or to see if I've grown weak?" Varric's lips curled into a grim smile. "Both." His hand rested on the hilt of the blade at his side, the metal glinting faintly. Elias stepped forward before she could answer. "If the Dominion wants her submission, they'll be waiting a long time," he said. The boldness of it made Sira's heart lurch, though his tone remained measured. Varric studied him with curiosity. "Human, you don't understand what storm you've walked into. She may be strong, but strength draws fire. The Dominion will not simply strike at her. They will strike at anyone near her. That means you." Elias did not flinch. "Then let them. Better to be near strength than to bow to cruelty." For a moment, the air between them was charged, and even Varric seemed caught off guard by the calm defiance in his voice. Sira finally spoke, breaking the tension. "If the Dominion wishes a fight, they will have one. But it will not be here, not tonight." Varric studied her for a long moment, then slowly released the grip on his weapon. "You haven't changed, Sira. Still stubborn, still unyielding." He stepped back into the shadows, his massive frame vanishing into the night. "But know this, the Dominion won't come as a handful of soldiers next time. They will come as a tide, and tides drown even the tallest stones." His words lingered. After he disappeared, leaving only silence and the faint hum of the bazaar behind them. Sira stood motionless, her jaw tight. She had known this would come, yet hearing it spoken aloud, hearing it from someone who had once trained beside her, made the weight heavier. She turned to Elias, expecting to find fear or doubt in his expression. Instead, she found something else: readiness. "You should leave Vera," she said, her tone sharper than intended. "This is not your fight." Elias met her gaze without hesitation. "Maybe not, but you stood for me when no one else did. I won't walk away now." The simplicity of it made her chest tighten in a way she could not name. He spoke as though loyalty was not a question but a certainty. They walked back to the cliffs where the city lights glimmered below like a sea of fireflies. Sira looked out across the horizon, the words of Varric echoing in her mind. A tide was coming. The Dominion would not forgive, and when they returned, they would bring force enough to test even her immense strength. Yet for the first time in years, she did not feel the weight of facing it alone. Elias stood beside her, small against her vast shadow but unshaken. He had no armor, no blade, and yet his presence steadied her more than any weapon could. She realized then that his strength was not in size nor in power. It was in his refusal to bend. The night wind carried the sound of distant engines, ships moving against the stars. Whether they belonged to merchants or Dominion scouts, she could not yet tell. But she knew the peace of Vera was slipping, the silence before the storm breaking apart. The path ahead would not be simple. Yet as she stood there with Elias beside her, Sira felt something new rising within her. A determination not only to stand, but to fight for more than survival. For the first time in years, the horizon did not look empty. It looked like the beginning of a war she had not chosen, but one she was no longer afraid to face. The moons of Vera hung low and pale as the city slumbered beneath them, but Sira could not find rest. She stood on the high cliffs overlooking the sprawl of glowing lanterns and market stalls, her massive form silhouetted against the horizon. Her conversation with Varric still echoed in her mind like the toll of a bell that refused to fade. The Dominion would come again, and when they did, it would not be with words but with fire. She had lived her life resisting such inevitabilities, walling herself off from bonds and alliances, but tonight felt different. Elias stood not far from her, sitting cross-legged on a flat stone staring at the stars as though they were old companions. His calmness baffled her. Any other being would have been crushed beneath the weight of Varric's warning, yet the human seemed almost meditative. She wondered if he truly did not grasp the danger, or if he understood it better than most and simply refused to bend beneath it. Sira remembered her younger years among the Thrinn, when warriors were taught that standing alone proved strength. But loneliness had cut deeper than any blade, and her size had made her isolation worse. Companionship had slipped through her grasp as easily as water, for most dared not stand near her shadow. Elias's presence unsettled her because it challenged the truth she had clung to, that she would always remain apart. She turned to him at last. "You still have a chance to leave this world before the Dominion arrives," she said, her deep voice carrying on the night wind. "You could vanish into the trade lanes, disappear where their eyes will not follow." Elias looked up at her and gave the faintest hint of a smile. "I've run before," he said simply, "and every time it brought me back to a place just like this, watching someone stronger than me fight alone while others hid. I won't repeat that mistake." His words disarmed her more than any weapon could. She searched for doubt in his voice but found none. He spoke not as one trying to prove himself, but as one who had already chosen his path. She wanted to argue, to tell him that his size, his fragility, made him unsuited for what was coming. But she could not. Something about his unwavering calm made her realize that strength was not always measured by mass or muscle. She looked back to the city, noticing movement below. Dominion scouts prowling at the bazaar's edge, already testing the air for resistance. The storm Varric had warned of was closer than she thought. The following day confirmed her fears. Merchants who had once eagerly displayed their wares now hurriedly packed them away, casting nervous glances at the skies. Patrols of armored soldiers marched through the avenues, their insignia glinting coldly in the sun. Sierra walked among them, her towering form impossible to hide, and everywhere she went silence followed. No one dared approach her, yet their eyes carried both expectation and desperation. They looked to her not as a threat now, but as something else, perhaps a shield, perhaps a spark of hope. She hated that weight. She had never asked to be anyone's symbol. And yet when her gaze swept over the frightened faces, she knew she could not step aside. Elias walked at her side, his small figure cutting an odd contrast against her colossal shadow. And still he did not waver. That night, she and Elias retreated to the edge of the cliffs again. But this time the silence was broken by the distant thunder of engines. Dominion warships pierced the sky like dark blades, their lights falling across the city. The crowd below scattered in panic, but Sira did not move. Her pulse quickened, not from fear but from anticipation. This was no patrol, no warning. This was the tide Varric had promised. Elias rose to his feet and looked at her. "You said they would come," he murmured, his voice steady. "Now they're here." She nodded slowly. And now we see who we truly are. The ships descended, releasing waves of soldiers into the streets. The ground trembled beneath their march, a river of armor flowing toward the heart of the bazaar. Sira's instincts roared within her, urging her to charge, to crush them before they rooted themselves. But she forced herself still. Recklessness would only lead to ruin. She had to be more than a warrior now. She had to be a leader. Her gaze swept the cliffs, noting the natural choke points where the streets narrowed. If the Dominion wanted control, they would funnel their forces there. She turned to Elias. "They expect me to fight alone," she said. "That is their mistake. Will you stand with me?" Elias met her eyes and nodded without hesitation. "Not just me," he said, gesturing back toward the bazaar. To her surprise, a small gathering of merchants and laborers had followed them, fear in their eyes, but something else too, a flicker of defiance. They carried no weapons save tools and makeshift clubs, but they had come all the same. For a moment, Sira could not speak. She had lived so long believing her presence only drove others away, yet here they stood, drawn not by fear but by hope. She turned back to Elias and he gave a quiet nod, as though confirming what she now knew. The tide was coming, but she would not face it alone. The first clash came at dawn. Dominion soldiers stormed the narrow streets, their boots striking in unison, their voices raised in cold command. Sira moved like a living wall, her immense frame blocking their advance. Her strikes were precise, each swing of her arm scattering armored figures like dry leaves in the wind. The soldiers expected brute force, but she gave them discipline, channeling her power with calm precision. Behind her, Elias and the others struck with whatever they carried, exploiting the choke points she had chosen. For every blow she dealt, he gave guidance, directing the defenders to move, to press, to retreat where needed. Together, their strengths wove into something greater than either could summon alone. The battle raged for hours, the city trembling beneath its weight. Sira's body bore fresh cuts, her strength tested to its limits, yet she did not fall. Each time her knees threatened to buckle, she looked to the crowd behind her, to Elias's unwavering stance, and something inside her reignited. At last, when the Dominion's line began to break, she let loose a roar that echoed across Vera, a sound that was not just fury but defiance, a promise that this world would not bow. The soldiers faltered, retreating to their ships with curses on their lips, leaving the streets littered but not broken. When the dust settled, the bazaar was scarred but alive. The people gathered around her, no longer whispering in fear but speaking openly, voices filled with gratitude and awe. Sira stood among them, bloodied but unbowed, and for the first time in years, she did not feel like an outcast. She felt like part of something larger, something worth protecting. Elias stepped. Beside her, his clothes torn, his face smudged with dirt, but his smile steady. "Looks like the tide hit the shore," he said quietly. She glanced down at him, exhaustion heavy in her bones, and gave the faintest smile of her own. "And the shore still stands." As the people lifted their voices in unison, cheering not just for her but for themselves, Sira knew the fight was far from over. The Dominion would return stronger and angrier, but now they would not face her alone. The tide had met the stone, and it had not drowned it. In that moment, beneath the rising sun of Vera, she realized that perhaps strength was never meant to stand apart, it was meant to be shared. And for the first time, she welcomed the weight of it. The fires of battle had barely cooled when the people of Vera began to rebuild, but Sira felt no sense of peace in the quiet aftermath. She stood at the edge of the grand bazaar, her massive, hands resting against a shattered pillar, gazing at the ruin the Dominion had left behind. Merchants who once haggled cheerfully now sifted through broken stalls, gathering what little they could salvage. Children whispered to each other, wide-eyed with both fear and awe as they glanced in her direction. To them, she was no longer the lonely giantess who sat in silence. She had become something far heavier, a living shield, a symbol they all relied upon. And though they cheered her name in gratitude, that same weight pressed against her chest, reminding her of the truth. She could not escape, the Dominion would return. This victory had been but a spark against the storm, and storms always came back. Elias noticed her quiet retreat as he always did, and approached with the steady calm that had unsettled her from the moment they first met. He carried no weapon, no armor, just that stubborn composure that never cracked even when shadows loomed darkest. He stood by her side looking at the broken stalls and scattered lives below. "You saved them," he said softly, not as praise but as fact. She shook her head. "I held the line," she replied. "But saving them? That is not finished. The Dominion does not give up. They will come again, and next time it will not be patrols or scouts. It will be legions." Elias turned to face her, his voice firm though his body seemed so small against her towering form. "Then let them come, because this time, you won't be the only one standing in their way." His words cut deeper than any wound she had suffered in battle, because for the first time she realized the tide had shifted not just in war, but in the hearts of the people. Already whispers spread through the market of forming defenses, of gathering supplies, of training even those who had never lifted a blade. What had been a scattered crowd was becoming something else, a community that would not bow. That night, when the moonlight fell silver across the broken city, Sira climbed the highest ridge overlooking the harbor where Dominion warships had fled. The stars above were restless, their glow muffled by the smoke of smoldering wreckage. She thought of her ancestors, proud Thryn warriors who lived and died by the creed that strength was isolation, that a warrior's burden was theirs alone. How many had perished in silence, never knowing the power of shared resolve? She clenched her fists, feeling the ache in her bruised arms, the sting of her cuts and the deeper ache of memory. She thought of how many times she had chosen solitude, out of fear, and how that very solitude had almost left her defenseless when the true tide came. Elias joined her quietly, his boots crunching against the rock, his presence now so natural beside her that she barely registered the strangeness of a human standing with a giantess of Thryn blood. "You're restless," he said simply. She didn't deny it. "I was raised to carry my own battles," she admitted. "Now I see that every battle touches more than just the one who fights it. I've been a fool for too long." Elias shook his head, the starlight catching faintly in his eyes. "Not a fool," he said. "Just someone who needed a reason to believe. Now you have one." She turned her gaze on him, curious. "And what reason do you have?" His answer was quiet, almost fragile, yet firm. "Because I've seen what happens when no one stands, and I refuse to watch it again." The days that followed became a storm of preparation. Where once Sira walked through empty paths, she now found herself surrounded by determined faces. Smiths worked without rest, reforging tools into weapons. Farmers practiced with spears made from broken carts. Even children practiced carrying water and supplies, preparing to support those who would fight. It startled her to see how quickly fear had turned to unity, and though she did not seek leadership, the people turned to her for guidance at every step. Elias stood at her side, speaking to them with a voice far less thunderous than hers, but no less commanding. His calmness steadied them, while her towering form inspired them. Together they became something neither could have been alone, a balance of heart and strength. And yet, beneath it all, Sira carried the gnawing fear of what was to come. The Dominion would not strike carelessly a second time. Their vengeance would fall swift and merciless. Could even this fragile unity withstand the storm? Late one evening, a scout returned breathless, announcing that Dominion banners had been sighted at the edge of the trade lanes, their ships amassing in far greater numbers. The bazaar fell into tense silence, the flicker of hope now tempered by the shadow of dread. Sira felt every eye turn toward her, and for a brief heartbeat the weight nearly crushed her. Then she stepped forward, her voice cutting through the heavy air. "We have seen their strength," she said, "and we have shown them ours. They believe fear will make us scatter. Let us show them they are wrong. We are not prey to be hunted. We are the tide that stands unbroken." The crowd erupted, voices rising not with blind courage, but with determination. For the first time in years, she did not feel the burden of her size. Instead, she felt lifted by the voices of those who now stood with her. Elias's gaze met hers across the crowd, and though no words passed between them, she understood. The true battle had not yet begun, but they would face it together. That night, as the stars wheeled overhead, she sat once more on the cliffs with Elias. The wind carried the faint scent of smoke and the hum of distant engines. "When they return," she said quietly, "it will test everything we've built. And if we fall—" Her voice trailed off, heavy with the thought. Elias looked at her and spoke with a quiet conviction that surprised her. "If we fall standing together. That's all anyone can ask. But I don't think we will. Because I've seen tides turn before, and this time I think it's in our favor." His certainty was a strange comfort, and for the first time in her life, Sira allowed herself to believe not in her own strength, but in the strength of all who now stood beside her. The storm was coming, and when it broke, the world would see whether the tide could hold. But as she rose to her full height, her shadow stretching long against the starlit ground, she no longer felt like an outcast. She felt like the stone in the river, the anchor in the storm. And she was ready. Under the pale light of Veyra's twin moons, the night seemed too quiet, almost as if the stars themselves held their breath in warning of what was about to come. The people of the city had worked for days preparing defenses, fortifying walls and forging crude weapons, but the Dominion was not a foe to be taken lightly. Their warships had been sighted at the edge of the system, vast black silhouettes drifting in formation like predators circling wounded prey. Sira stood at the city's highest wall, her colossal frame unmoving as she watched the horizon where flames of dissent might appear at any moment. She had fought battles before, but never as part of something greater than herself, never with so many lives balanced on the weight of her shoulders. Elias stood beside her, his face grim but calm, the torchlight flickering across his determined expression. He held no blade in his hands, but his words had become weapons in their own right, binding the people's hearts together when fear threatened to scatter them. "They will come at dawn," he said, his voice steady. "But when they do, they won't find a city begging for mercy. They will find a city that refuses to break." His words echoed into the night, carried by the wind, and though Sira said nothing, her silence was a vow of its own. As the first streaks of dawn broke the sky, the Dominion ships descended, their engines roaring like thunder, their shadows blotting out the light. Columns of armored soldiers poured from the dropships, their armor gleaming black, their banners snapping in the wind with symbols that promised conquest and cruelty. The people of Veyra gathered on the walls, farmers and smiths clutching spears, merchants wielding blades fashioned from broken tools, children carrying water for those who would fight. Fear clung to them, but behind that fear burned something stronger: resolve. And at the center of it all, towering above them, stood Sira, her massive figure casting a shadow that fell across the walls like a guardian carved from living stone. When the Dominion warlord stepped forward, his voice carried across the battlefield, promising annihilation to all who resisted. But before he could finish, Sira's own voice thundered across the air, a sound so deep it shook the stones beneath her feet. "You will find no prey here," she declared. "You will find a people who will not bow. Step forward and know that every step is into the storm you cannot control." For a moment, even the Dominion soldiers hesitated, unsettled by the sheer force of her presence. The battle began with fire raining from the Dominion ships, crashing into the walls in a blaze of stone and dust. The defenders staggered, but they did not scatter. Archers loosed arrows, cannons forged from repurposed trade metal spat flame, and Sira leapt from the wall with a force that shook the earth as she landed among the invading soldiers. Her fists swung like hammers, crushing armor and scattering formations, her sheer size a weapon the Dominion had not prepared to face. Yet the tide was relentless, waves of soldiers pressing forward, their discipline unshaken, their weapons advanced beyond anything the defenders had. Elias moved through the chaos not with brute strength but with unyielding will, rallying the defenders whenever the line faltered, pulling wounded back to safety, and guiding strikes against the enemy's weak points. Together, the giantess and the human became the unspoken heart of the resistance, one striking with thunder, the other guiding like steel through fire. Hours dragged on like days. The air filled with smoke, dust and cries, the clash of steel against steel echoing across the city. Sira's arms ached, blood trickled down her side where a blade had pierced her armor, but still she fought, her roars shaking the battlefield. Every time she fell to one knee, she forced herself back up, driven not by pride but by the sight of those behind her who refused to abandon their posts simply because she still stood. Elias, though smaller and fragile compared to her, seemed to move with tireless resolve, never faltering, his presence a reminder to the people that this was not just Sira's fight, it was theirs. And then, as the sun dipped toward the horizon, the Dominion warlord himself entered the fray, his armor gleaming crimson, his blade humming with deadly energy. His strikes were precise and merciless, cutting through defenders as if they were nothing. When his eyes locked on Sira, the crowd seemed to hold its breath, for here stood the true test of their strength. The clash between them shook the earth. His blade met her fists with sparks, each strike a storm that echoed through the battlefield. He was faster, his movements honed by decades of war, but she had something he did not, the will of her people at her back. Every roar she gave was met with cheers from the walls. Every strike she landed was answered by renewed courage in the defenders. Still, his blade carved deep, his strikes unrelenting, and soon she found herself driven to the ground, her strength faltering. The warlord raised his blade for the final blow, and silence fell across the city. But then, before the strike could land, Elias hurled himself between them, his small frame a wall of defiance that shocked even the warlord. His voice carried across the battlefield, raw and unbroken. "She does not stand alone." "The people," echoed his cry, their voices rising into a thunderous roar that shook the invaders' resolve. In that moment, Sira rose again, her massive hand seizing the warlord's blade, wrenching it free with a force that shattered steel. With a final, "Strike!" she brought him crashing to the ground, his armor broken, his command shattered. The Dominion forces faltered, their discipline cracking as their leader fell. The defenders pressed forward, their cries rising, and for the first time in living memory, the unstoppable tide of the Dominion broke upon the will of a single city. When the last of their ships fled into the sky, silence fell once more. Not the silence of fear, but the silence of disbelief, of a people who realized they had stood against the storm and remained unbroken. Sira stood in the center of the battlefield, her massive frame battered and bloodied, yet her eyes shone not with isolation, but with something new, belonging. Elias, bruised and weary, stood beside her, a small figure against her vast form, yet equal in every way that mattered. The people gathered around them, not bowing in fear, but lifting their voices in triumph. And for the first time in her life, Sira felt not the burden of being too large, too different, too alone. She felt the strength of being part of something greater than herself. The storm had come, and together, they had turned the tide.